Hi, everybody, and welcome to Aloud. This is a full house. I'm Jessica Strand, the Director of Programs and Strategic Engagement for the Library Foundation of Los Angeles. Last week, we began our exciting fall season, and what a season it is. Nearly every week until mid-December, we will be hosting an Aloud program. The variety of guests move from discussing the pressing issues of our day to fiction of the moment, to celebrating one of America's great playwrights, to ringing in the holidays with the New York Times games and cooking sections. Ooh, maybe you want to turn that off. Our guests range from tonight's exceptional speakers to Susan Orlean, to Issa Rae, to Tim Wu, and Tony Kushner, along with a host of others. For further information, go to lfla.org/aloud, and we'd love to see you all there. At a time when intellectual freedom and democratic values are being stifled, books are being banned, and access to civic and public goods like education, parks, radio, and even health information is shrinking. My voice starts shrinking as well. Our libraries can stand strong with our doors wide open to everyone. Libraries are an essential path to our future, ensuring equitable access to key resources, advancing literacy and knowledge, and quickly responding to the multiple needs and challenges of our broad and diverse communities. Supporting the Los Angeles Public Library isn't just about believing in the institution. It's about believing in the people who walk through our doors every day. If you are not yet a member, I hope you will consider joining. Now more than ever, we really need your help. And there, look, aha. There you can go. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the many dedicated advocates and supporters here tonight who help sustain our mission. Members of the Leadership Circle, bibliophiles, the Council, and the Young Literati. Thank you all so much. Thank you. These membership groups are vibrant communities of library lovers dedicated to championing our city's most valuable resource. Thank you. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Humanities Endowment Fund, the Ralph M. Parsons Foundation, Judith and Steve Krantz Foundation, Peck Endowment for Cultural Programs, Golden Globe Foundation, Aaron Fox Schiff, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors through Department of Arts and Culture, Deloitte, and Sharon Oxbow Endowed Fund for Aloud. Now, finally, for tonight's program, we are thrilled to welcome Nicholas Boggs with his new biography, Baldwin, A Love Story. I'm a giant fan of Baldwin, so when I heard last spring that an extensive biography was coming out in the fall that contained material that had never been seen or discussed, I knew I wanted to not only read this book, but to present it aloud. Since then, the biography has been heralded by numerous newspapers and periodicals across the country, and Boggs himself has been interviewed extensively about his deeply researched, thoughtfully conceived, and beautifully written book. This is the first major biography of James Baldwin in 30 years. Our review in the New York Times put it aptly, quote, Boggs has produced a stunning book. The reader is immersed in the man of Baldwin, the chaos and talent, the tragedy and the aching heart, the flesh that itches to be touched and the voice that will not be suppressed. This biography explores the ceaseless romantic Baldwin, in love with love, it always in the distance, him always chasing. An undergraduate, Nicholas Boggs, discovered James Baldwin out-of-print children's book, Little Man, A Story of Childhood, in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. After he tracked it down, its illustrator, the French artist Yaron Kazak, he went on to co-head an acclaimed new edition of the book in 2018. His writing has also been anthologized in the Cambridge Companion to James Baldwin Now, The Speculative Light, The Art of Buford Delaney, and James Baldwin. He is a recipient of the 2023 Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant and fellowships from the National Endowment of Humanities, the Beinecke Library, and the Gilder Lerman Center at Yale, the Schomburg Center Scholars in Residence Program, and he said to me backstage, I've just had so many fellowships, and the National Humanities Center. Nicholas Boggs will be in conversation with Lena Waithe, writer, producer, and founder of the Hillman Grad. She didn't want me to say anything more. In fact, she wanted me to make it shorter. So I'm going to bring them out right now. Please welcome Nicholas Boggs and Lena Waithe. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Hi, how are you? Thank you for being here. I have some of your questions here. We're going to get to them. They're going to wave at me 20 minutes before we're done so we can get some of these questions in. And I can read the handwriting, so we're all good there. Hello, Nicholas. How are you?
I'm great. So happy to be here. I get to talk to Lena Waithe, you guys.
I mean, the honor is all mine because we're talking about someone. Yes, I'm wearing a T-shirt. I thought, I was like, is this too on the nose? But I didn't care. Yes, I wear it, I wear it anyway. No, I mean, I was very honored to read the book early, and I was really nervous about having to write a blurb because, it's hard to summarize how significant the book is. It's hard to summarize how spiritual the journey is that we go on, that you take us on, of his life. And Baldwin is such an important figure is an understatement. He is someone that I think, I look to for guidance, not just in terms as a writer, but as a human being. So with that said, I wanted to ask you, what did you learn about yourself while learning about this incredible human being?
Well, since I've been reading him and writing about him for almost 30 years, I would say that I've learned almost everything, certainly a political education, certainly an education how to move through the world as a sexual being, right, under certain regimes and definitions, and how to be yourself within those. But I think the greatest gift he gave me, which took the whole 20 years of really researching and writing it, is that he turned me into the writer that I wanted to be. And that Toni Morrison has that quote, you have to write the book that you want to read that's not out there. And that was me. I mean, I read all the Baldwin biographies, which were terrific in the 90s, but I noticed that there were these gaps, and there were things that I wanted to know about him and his life, especially his love life, and how that impacted him and his work, which is all about love. And so I didn't set out to write a biography 30 years ago, but he taught me in order to write the book that I wanted, which was really narrative, right? Really telling stories, really driven by intimacy and emotion, that I would have to learn how to become the writer who could do that. And that took me my whole life.
Yes, please. What I think I really picked up on, and I didn't realize that I wasn't doing this, but I think some of us think of Baldwin as a sort of a figure to worship. And when you worship a human being, you forget their humanity. And I think what you do is you bring his humanity. I think I was texting you a little bit when I was reading it, just because I was seeing a person, not just sort of a deity, not just someone to worship and put on a pedestal. And I think a big part of that were the letters, But also what I loved was the frustration he would feel sometimes in the letters, in some of these love letters to different lovers or people, of saying, you said you were gonna come and you didn't, or why haven't you written me back yet? Or, I'm not sending any money. Like, you know what I'm saying? It was like, I've texted that, to people. And I think that it really, because sometimes you feel sad for him. Sometimes you feel embarrassed. Sometimes you feel like, oh, I can't imagine the loneliness that he must have felt. And I'm just curious, were you, as you were seeing these things, and you obviously made the decision to put it into the book, what were you thinking about and what were you trying to convey to us while you were inserting the particular letters that you did?
Well, in a way, I wasn't looking to convey anything. I was trying to create a space for him to convey himself, right? I didn't come in with an agenda, If I had any agenda, it was like, I want us to see him as the full human being that he was, who had struggles, who had joy too. I mean, there's this narrative sometimes that Baldwin had this tragic life, right? That he never found the great love, or that he was, this ridiculous notion that he was a failure because he didn't end racism. Like that's his responsibility. So I wanted to sort of show all the facets of him. So I wasn't trying to convey any particular part except to say he's human, but also, I love that you can't imagine, you guys. I'd finished the book, no one had really read it. I sent it to Lena Waithe, and then I'm getting like audios from her, like as she's reading it. It's just an incredible experience that I'll never forget.
Well, yeah, I had, because there was just like throwing me. And I think a very personal thing that I was experiencing at the time, because it wasn't public yet, but that I had, well, you know this because you came to a reading of my first play. And it was a very interesting step into that realm, and very vulnerable. And I, who was a person who thought I knew everything there was to know about Baldwin, I didn't know that he really dreamed about being not just an essayist, not just a novelist, but a playwright. And reading that, I was sort of blown away by that connection, because you want to feel connected to the people that you follow. And I'm wondering, what were you thinking about when writing that part of the book? Because he also, I don't want to say he failed. I don't think he failed as a playwright. I think if he were sitting here, he might disagree with that. But what I love so much about the way you present it in the book is that obviously he really was passionate about writing a play, particularly the one, The Welcome Table. But he becomes friends with Lorraine Hansberry, who liked his play. She enjoyed it. She went to a reading. Yeah. And it wasn't exactly everything I think he wanted it to be, but she knew there was something there. And what I love about it is, like, she tells him, well, I'm writing a play. And and he's like, okay, and of course she writes the play to end all plays. The play that I still go back to and look at, and I also love, obviously, his essay, Sweet Lorraine, where he talks about that play and why that play defines us as a society. So that being said, what were you thinking about when writing about his playwright era, as I call it?
Well, Lorraine, first of all, this play is amazing. I saw early versions of it. It's like a queer Waiting for Godot with 3 incredible actresses. It's amazing. So I'm excited for that.
Thank you. But I'm just grateful to know that Baldwin too was trying his hardest to be. Yes, it is hard as hell trying to write a play.
Yeah, so he actually went to Sidney Poitier gave him his house seats to see A Raisin in the Sun when it's in reviews in Philadelphia. So that was pretty amazing.
Like, what is this world? What is this life?
This was before Baldwin was that big, actually. This was early on. I mean, I think seeing Lorraine Hansberry's success really fired him up. I mean, he really was excited to see what could be done with Black life on stage, and really helped lead to Blues for Mr. Charlie and The Odd Man Corner. But
that's why I was so moved by it.
Yeah, but his life, his junior high school yearbook, it says what he wants to be when he grows up is a playwright. And then it says below it, the quote is, "Fame is the spur, but ouch." Almost like he knew that fame was going to hurt, and it did hurt him. It did menace him. Plays were so important to him. I mean, I'm going to start backwards. The Welcome Table is the final literary work that he was working on in St. Paul de Vence before he died. It was never really performed. This is a fascinating play where he's writing from the perspective, the protagonist is sort of based on him, but it's also kind of based on Lena Horne. It's a woman, Laverne. He's actually tackling AIDS for the only time in his work in this play. And it's really based on his life and his loves. And he's also looking into kind of the ways that colonialism was operating, but he had the Algerian gardener who was working. So he's going to all these interesting places. Right. But before that, he directed a play, Fortune in Men's Eyes, in Istanbul, okay? Which is like a gay prison play by John Herbert, and he does it in this very socially conservative country in Istanbul. He had just gotten there, but he loved doing it. He directed it. He didn't write it, but he directed it.
In a different language too.
Sorry?
Wasn't he doing a different language?
It was in Turkish.
Right.
Yes. I mean, it was incredible. He didn't speak Turkish.
Like, no, I'm assuming people have read the book. If you haven't, I'm so sorry. Like, if there's spoilers and whatnot, but still, like, you'll still be surprised when you get to that part in the book.
But the reason it was so meaningful to him actually is that he had just come recently from LA, and not to diss LA at all.
Please don't.
But
come on.
He had a horrible experience. He came out here.
He did.
To write the screenplay for Columbia Pictures for Malcolm X.
I know.
And they tried to cast Charlton Heston as Malcolm X.
I know.
We'll just pause for a second.
I know. It really fucked me up because I was like, because I also know if Baldwin, you pray if Baldwin could have met my ass, he would have been like, I don't know how you figured this out, baby. I don't know how you navigating this shit. But it is also depressing as fuck when reading that, because you go like, I would have loved if he could have gotten an opportunity to really write a screenplay or have that freedom to do that. And so that's why that part of the book is, to me, very heartbreaking, his experience with Hollywood.
Yeah, Hollywood, I mean, he swallowed some pills and thought about taking his own life. It was such a horrible experience. Also, Martin Luther King had just been assassinated. And he got the phone call from somebody who I think is in the audience today, so I want to give a shout out to David Moses, Baldwin's collaborator and dear friend. There he is.
Hello.
There he is.
You raise your hand. Thank you for being here.
Well, David was also on stage with him at Carnegie Hall and Ray Charles, I believe, in the 70s, doing a play. A play, kind of a mix of jazz and drama. So just such a pleasure to have you here tonight.
Yes,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Blues for Mr. Charlie was also a very important play to him. I mean, that was a really rough time in his life. That play was so political, and it drove the Actors Studio and all these places crazy. But he was so into it. I mean, he really he was doing this interesting thing of breaking the fourth wall and implicating the white audience as jurors. I mean, it was really fascinating what he was doing. He also, when they tried to close down the play, almost as if it was the March on Washington, he protested it and got all these pamphlets, and he got everybody organized to keep it on, and he did. And the Amen Corner, I still think, is one of his best play. I think it's an excellent play.
Thank you so much for talking about that part of his life. I do want to go back a little bit because I feel like, yes, he wrote movie reviews, which are really amazing. If you don't have the book, The Price of the Ticket, yes, if you don't have that, please get it. It's a collection of a lot of his work, some reviews, a lot of essays, things like that. But I think fell in love with Baldwin first as an essayist. Those were some of the first things I read, and before I got to the novels, which I think is kind of an interesting way to discover him. I think a lot of people know the novels, and the novels are beautiful, but I think what I like about the essays is his personality jumping out at you. You can't help it. You can hear his voice when you read his essays. When you were, I'm sure obviously you were going back and revisiting them, what are some of your favorite essays of his? I know I have mine. I have my definitely Sweet Lorraine for sure is up there. And I think this quote I believe is also from one of the essays that sticks with me, and I'm also curious what you think about it, where he says, heroes are meant to be destroyed. I know. I read that and still trying to make sense of it, and it hits me again and again and again. And that's the thing, some of his sentences, some of his words, you have to live a little bit for you to really be able to digest them. But I'm just curious, from the essays for you, what are some that jump out, and what did you learn about him from some of those pieces that I call personality pieces, really?
Listen, Baldwin was the greatest essayist of the 20th century, so to pick a favorite is very difficult. Of course, The Fire Next Time is a classic. Notes of a Native Son is a classic. But in this book, I was particularly interested in No Name in the Street, because of his later work that was really important, sort of the post-civil rights moment. But also some of his short, beautiful essay on the painter Buford Delaney. It's just 2 pages. Buford Delaney, for those of you who don't know, is this very important painter, black painter, who was Baldwin's mentor in Greenwich Village. When Baldwin was 16, he went to his studio. He was 37, and he taught him how to see the world as an artist. He introduced him to blues and jazz. He became what Baldwin called his spiritual father, and the first person who made it possible for him to see that a black man could be an artist. He also painted many beautiful portraits of Baldwin, which are now worth a lot of money. But back then, he was quite struggling, and he followed Baldwin to Paris. But what he says in that, among other things, he tells this story about walking down the street, right, on Broadway, and Buford points down at a gutter and says, "Look, what do you see?" And Baldwin says, "I don't see anything, I see a gutter." He says, "Look again." And he looks again, he sees that the buildings are being reflected back in the water into something beautiful. So it was a lesson in how to see the world as an artist. He talked about this all the time, how to witness the world. So looking at these other essays that might not be as well known were also interesting to me, because he said, no greater lover has ever held a brush, is what he said about Buford Delaney. And he wasn't speaking about lover in a sexual sense. He was speaking in this much broader sense, the same way he talked about love in The Fire Next Time, the same way he talked about it elsewhere. So that's one essay. Another essay that I found that nobody had ever really read, that was published, was he was great at writing about people he knew and about artists like Lorraine. And he wrote about an essay about his friend and collaborator and lover, Joran Kazak. And it was another sort of beautiful, beautiful essay about how Joran saw the world. And it was actually Joran Kazak, he had been introduced to Joran Kazak by Buford Delaney in Parisian circles in the late 1950s. So while we have the classics, we also have many smaller essays that offer important windows into his life.
That's interesting. I want to talk about, there's really beautiful images of Baldwin, many, but some of my favorite images are of him amongst the people. And you also mentioned about fame and how I think there's a lot of frustrating things about it. But I think, and I also relate to this element too, is that I want to be just another person in the crowd so I can observe it, so I can be a part of it, so I can then write about it. And Baldwin, I think, did kind of toe the line in that people knew who he was. But there was an element, I feel, and I found looking at the book as well, is that people felt like he was one of them, even though they knew he was special. And because he would go down, he would be in Europe, but then something would happen and he would go to down south and he would go to the churches and obviously would interview Martin Luther King Jr. and liked him and obviously would talk to Malcolm X. And I'm just curious for you, why was that so important to him to kind of let the fame be away from him a little bit? Because he needed to be one of the people, and he also was. He was affected by what was happening in the world, but he needed to be able to write about it, and he had to do it within the crowd.
Well, he had those sort of two poles to his personality. So he moved to France in part to get away from the racism and all of that, and sort of his best friend committing suicide, and to become a writer. And he actually really loved being a stranger in the village, as he put it in his famous essay, because he felt it was from another place that you could really see America better. Because when you're in America, you have nothing to compare it to. That's how he put it. So he kind of fed on being an outsider. I think in part it's because he grew up feeling like an outsider, like a strange child. It was sort of familiar to him as a creative stance. But that's also why, once he became too famous in France, that's part of why he moved to Istanbul. And he loved not being able to speak Turkish. And he loved being able to get lost in a crowd and not be known. However, he also loved children, and he loved community. So his first trip back to the South after living in France in 1957, that's when he went down and met King for the first time. But he also went back to the church. And you have to remember that Baldwin grew up in the church, very religious family, became a preacher himself. Giving that up was a huge moment in his life. And he had sort of stepped away from it, but not really, because he went to the church in the South, and he realized, wow, not only is this a space of religion, but it's also a space of community that he had been missing. And not just with community, but also political mobilization. He understood that it had all of that power, and I think he needed that. But he also needed total isolation in order to create his art. So his whole life, he was a transatlantic commuter, he called himself, moving back and forth because he kind of couldn't write. He hated New York. I said something bad about LA, but he really hated New York.
Yeah.
Like, he did not want to be in New York. So, that was his push and pull.
Man, it's like, I think that's the classic writer's struggle. You want to be at the party, but you have a deadline to meet. There's also the movie, geez, it is like a movie. The book makes me think about capitalism. Because when you think about Baldwin, you know that he is on a different kind of mission. And it really is, I believe, to leave us all with an inheritance, which is his work. And the thing that you can tell in the letters and things like that, Baldwin is frustrated about the idea of needing to take care of himself, like with money. And it's frustrating for me to read because, and he does get grants and he does do artist, residencies that comes up throughout the book. But it is frustrating that all he wants to do is just sit at a typewriter with a cigarette and write. But you have to have capital to be carefree. And I'm curious, when you were writing about this and documenting it, what was that like for you? Was that hitting you as well? Because I know you weren't trying to have that agenda, but for me, I could not help but to have that beat in my head about the fact that he was dealing with that while trying to leave us a beautiful inheritance.
I mean, I was so broke while I was writing most of this book that when I was reading the parts of him being broke, I was like, okay, I understand. I can get into it. I can explain this. And I was getting another grant, so I could, thank you to the Schomburg, thank you to the Leon Levy Center for Biography. These places, I could never have written this book without that kind of support. So I did kind of understand what he was going through. And in fact, I couldn't even find the voice for this book. I wrote the first quarter of the book in the New York part. And I was writing all about Baldwin struggling to find his voice and trying to become a writer, and I couldn't find my voice. And then as soon as he got to France in part 2, suddenly I found my voice. It was this magical thing that happened. So I was shocked somewhat by, if he had money, he would give it away.
Yeah.
But he needed it a lot. So he went up to the artist residency at Yaddo before he hit it big. And he was going through a terrible breakup, and he ran up, for them, a huge phone bill, right? And Yaddo, as artist residencies goes, it was the first one to integrate, right? So it had Langston Hughes went there, others. But there were still these they still looked at African-American artists differently. They were watching them differently, especially male ones. And so they made a big deal over this phone bill. Now, it was a big phone bill, but this is James Baldwin, and he already had he'd already written Go Tell It on the Mountain. He was already, money was not his priority. It was a means to an end. Right. He did want to have a nice house in the south of France, though.
True, which he, eventually got there, it's interesting because I think having a better understanding about his love life gave me a better understanding about his work. Were you, as you were diving into these stories, it almost feels like you are reading someone's diary when looking at these letters and getting a better understanding of him. Do you feel like the love story exposes the work in a new way? Or do you want people to go back and revisit the work after knowing a little bit more about what he was going through in his personal life at the time in which he was writing it?
Both. I mean, all 4 of these relationships were with men that he dedicated novels to, and or who he collaborated with very specifically. So I felt like to understand his creative process, it was important to look at their relationships. Buford in particular, his spiritual father, they were lifelong friends, right? You couldn't really understand Baldwin's concept of love, his concept of how to see the world without Buford. Lucien, he dedicated Giovanni's Room to him, his second novel, but his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Baldwin moved to Paris. He could not finish this novel. He couldn't even come up with a title. So Lucien is 17 years old, and he's kind of penniless and moved to Paris to become an artist. But his parents have some money and some like a chalet in the Swiss Alps. So Lucien pretends he has tuberculosis and gets his father to give them that place for months over a course of a year and a half. The first time they go, Baldwin is really sick. Lucien nurses him back to health. They go on a hike in the mountains, and Baldwin comes up with a title. The second time they go back, Baldwin brings Bessie Smith records, and that's when he realizes the voice of the novel, which he had not been able to find. The third time they go back, he finishes the novel. So you cannot understand Baldwin's creative process without understanding this man's place in his life. And then, same with Giovanni's Room. They broke up. He goes to Yaddo. He's writing what he thinks is a short story called Giovanni's Room, and he realizes this is a novel, and it's totally based on, in many ways, their love triangle and breakup. So it's not a salacious book at all. I don't go into that kind of stuff. I go into the material that matters for understanding the work and understanding the depth of who Baldwin was as a person.
I think that's what it does for me. It gives me, because I enjoy the novels without knowing that, but knowing it sort of makes them sort of dance in a different way for me. Because then you realize, oh, like any other writer, it's like, I'm going to put what your lovers, your exes into the work. Because you also, in a way, want them to know what they meant to you and what you did what they did to you as well.
Beale Street is a perfect example. I mean, that great movie by Barry Jenkins, but it's based on, he dedicates it to Joran Kazak. So that love affair is based on Baldwin's love affair with a French dude in Italy, okay, in many ways. But that's Baldwin. He can be doing many things at once. It's not one thing. It's all the multiplicities, right? It's all the complications. And that's what I was trying to get at.
Right. It's also interesting because him, obviously, as a queer person, he knows how to write straight people, because I believe that queer folks know straight people better than they know themselves.
Right. Just like he could write white people better than they could write
Black
themselves.
folk know white people, because we have to. Speaking of the queerness, you know I will. Oh my God, I love this. This is such a good group. Here's the thing about, I think, when you're a queer person in the world, you see the world differently because you do not abide by society's rules. You just can't. And what is interesting about him and his peers, and there was some that respected him. Obviously, you know what happened with Richard Wright. There was some interesting energies that were happening, and I think Baldwin understood this, is that he was able to actually see the world more clearly than his peers. They were seeing it in black and white, and he could see the world in color. And I think there was a resentment because of that. And I think they actually didn't understand why they were resenting him. And as you were, and I think he knew that they didn't understand why there was a frustration toward him. And what I appreciate is that he wasn't afraid to say, no, there's a new way to look at the world, and you guys are looking at it in a very simple way. What did you discover about how he had to break away from the pack after even being praised by them? And he had to shun that peer group. And I'm sure that also was not easy, and also I think spoke to his loneliness. But I am grateful that he was willing to be a lone soldier, so that way we could all see the world in color rather than continuing to write it and paint it in black and white.
I love that you said that he sees it in color, because I think that's so true. It's his children's book, Little Man, that helped bring back into print.
Yes, and we're very
It
grateful
was
for
all
that.
about, showing these different shades of the children's skin colors, right? It's a beautiful book for that reason. But now I forgot your question.
No. He was able to see the world differently because I believe he was queer, and his peers.
Oh, he was always an outsider. So he wrote "Go Tell It on the Mountain," and then people expected him, especially the white literary establishment, but the black literary establishment too, expected him to write a sequel. Oh, great, that was successful. Let's write another, second version of that. And what does he do? He says, no. I'm going to write a first-person novel from this perspective of a closeted white American man in Paris. And he sent this off to the publishers, and they said, Knopf, and they said, hell no. But what did he do? He said, that's fine, I'll take it over to Europe. And he took it over to England, he sold it there. Turned around, Dial Press back in the States wanted to buy it. And now it's probably the most important classic gay novel, of all time.
Or novel in general, one of the most important novels in general.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then even after that, and we're just talking about novels now, not essays or plays. So what happens next? Okay, so he writes The Fire Next Time, which is of course such an important classic, but he's writing in that novel about how black and white Americans have to come together like lovers in order to change the world.
Yes.
He's being metaphorical, but then he gets literal in another country in a certain sense, and he shows just how messy that is, and just what a failure it is for white Americans to really look in the eye of their lovers and contend with the history of enslavement and its implications. They couldn't do it because they wanted to be innocent, as Baldwin put it, this false innocence. So, that tells us that we have to read his nonfiction and his fiction together, in my opinion.
I agree.
In order to understand them and not put them in a hierarchy that people do. I love that you love the novels, but many people don't think that much of them. But I think a lot of them, I think especially After Another Country, which is a great novel. Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone was ahead of its time in how it was exploring black queer love, black fame. That was set out here in Hollywood. And then his final novel, Just Above My Head, is a masterpiece. I mean, people are starting to say that now and understand that. And Beale Street could talk as well. I mean, he never did the expected thing, though. He was a true artist in that sense. He was responding to what his gut as an artist told him needed to be done.
Yes, and I want to get into the criticism just in general, but I did want to touch on, as I listen to his interviews, I'll send you some every now and then, and they're like his speaking engagements. Seriously, go to YouTube. They will speak to you as if he is hitting right today in 2025. Like it is not, doesn't feel dated at all. But what he talked about was like, to love is to modify. Yeah, he was talking about our society and the Negro problem, if you will, at the time. But it's teaching me so much just about love romantically, even though he's talking about it, how we need to love each other as a society. And he really, the thing that Baldwin always say teaches me, or always say Baldwin says, or Baldwin says this, but he really did not believe in race. He's like, this is not real. This is a scam. And he was saying that then. And you see, obviously, he's doing these interviews and he's on these morning shows and sitting next to Harry Belafonte and everybody else. And they're talking about the Negro problem. And he's like...
That's a white problem, actually.
Right. Because he's like, it's not real. And I think that, and also because he was in interracial relationships, not all of them, but some of them. And I think that is why he was able to say that. And yet we still struggle with when you see whether they be queer or not. There is this thing that we can't get over, this odd hump that we can't move past about love being not political. Love is not political at all. It is guttural, it is spiritual, it is godly. And Baldwin understood that. And I think he must have been frustrated that the world could not understand it. Now I want to go talk about criticism real quickly. He talks about it being like soul crushing because some of his books, obviously he began as a critical darling, and then it turned, as it always does. And obviously we know that his work has stood the test of time. He wrote very eloquently about how some black folks weren't fans of Raisin in the Sun, but how he talked about how that play was not for the generation it was put in front of, but for those that had not been born yet. Yep. What would you say about how he had to be a human and deal with people feeling as if his work was passé.
Well, the good news is by the time his last novel came out in 1979, and the New York Times was sort of asking him about that, and he said, all the great artists are judged after their time, sort of like what you were just saying. So I think he had come to some peace with that later in his life, in 1979 by then. But it was very painful for him in the early 70s and the late 60s when he was rejected. Listen, he was so, people thought that he was sort of closer to Martin Luther King than Malcolm X, but that's not really true. He was closer in ideology and belief to Malcolm X. So to be rejected by black nationalists, some, not all, that can also be overstated. Huey Newton, was a huge fan of Baldwin's and was not homophobic towards Baldwin, but there was Eldridge Cleaver, there was that strain. So he's dealing with both homophobia from white people, homophobia from some prominent black people, and then also just the racism of the country. So that's a lot to deal with, obviously. But he also put it famously in an interview. An interviewer asked him, what is it like to grow, you grew up black, poor, and gay, and Baldwin said, I hit the jackpot. He's like, because I have this perspective. And not only does he have the perspective, he also has the facility with language, right? He was visionary. You have to have all of that. So I think he knew that he was called and that he was a witness and that was what he had to do. So I think he withstood it. But definitely in the 60s, that was a very, 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 very painful moment for him where he felt rejected by his people. But then he felt re-embraced by others later. What's his name? Excellent novelist, young black novelist who came to visit him in St. Paul de Vence, and he'd been an important novelist for many black nationalists, and he loved Baldwin, and they connected, and he'd come there and write. So he had some very positive experiences too, I'd say.
No, that's real. And my last question before I get to some of you guys' questions, or really observation that I made, and I think this is one of the voice notes I sent you. I love when he sits down with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And he goes and he's like sitting at the table with all of them, he's is sort of welcomed in, and there's this element of them wondering, like, are you one of us, brother? Are you gonna come over here? And he sits comfortably in his skin. And basically, they ask him, like, well, what religion do you belong to? And he says, I'm a writer. And I hit you because I am a person who was raised by lazy Christians, as I like to call them. They only go to church on Mother's Day and Easter, sometimes Palm Sundays. But it's like Oprah talks about her mom would go to church because she wanted people to think she was a Christian. She didn't behave as one. But Baldwin, I kind of in that moment was enlightened, and I realized that is his belief system. That is what he believes in, the typewriter. That is where he worships. And he also worships humanity, and he believed in it, and he wanted to understand it as best he could. And I think you do a really beautiful job of helping us see how much he wanted for us as a society. He wanted us to be our best selves. And he grew up in a time in which we were at our worst. And I think he would also be just as disappointed and frustrated and disturbed by the lack of humanity that sometimes shows up in our world. But he also would say, like he does so beautifully as he sits across from Nikki Giovanni, and he says, I'm an optimist because I'm alive. Yeah. And with that, I'm gonna go to y'all's questions. Okay, this is a question I really like. Is it Dougie? Dougie? Okay, Dougie. Okay. It says, if the book was to burn today, and that's not a crazy notion, what chapter would you want to save?
I would have to save. I'll tell you a section that I would save.
Okay, yeah, section. Because it's, yeah, it's section.
So, I discovered the out-of-print children's book, and then I discovered that the artist was alive. Everybody thought he was dead. This was 1990, this was 2003.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I went over and interviewed him in Paris. And he was Baldwin's sort of last great love and collaborator, and he died in 2005. And I was really trying to understand the texture of their relationship. He dedicated If Beale Street Could Talk to Him. And then in 2018, I went to visit his wife in Tuscany to see the original illustrations for the book and to see if she had any information, correspondence, whatever. And I'm there in her Tuscan house overlooking, in her bedroom. She's strewn out on the table like art catalogs and some documents, and the sun is about to set, and she finds a 7-page love poem, unpublished, that Baldwin wrote to her husband. And there's a rusty metal paperclip on it because it's 45 years old. She hasn't looked at it in 45 years. And she read it out loud to me, translating it back from the French into English because her husband didn't speak English, so Baldwin wrote it in French. And it was this beautiful poem that was so universal at the same time. They had just come back from a hot springs, and then Baldwin had gotten back to St. Paul de Vence, and Joran had stayed in Tuscany. And it's a poem where he talks about waking up and wondering where he is, and has he gone to the bathroom yet? Has he shaved? And then Baldwin talks about reading his horoscope and reading his horoscope. We've all done that. We've all done that.
Relatable.
And it was just such it was sort of what I had been looking for 20 years. I was looking for this evidence, the evidence of things not seen. I was looking for this evidence of their relationship, and through it, this window into Baldwin as a human being, and what was sort of moving him to create his art, both on political levels, aesthetic levels, but also personal levels. So I could not lose that part of the book, because it'd be like losing that love poem twice,
That's really good. That's beautiful. Yeah. I'm going to ask this one. What was your biggest surprise that you uncovered during your research?
That's tough questions tonight. This is
I
like this
like
LA
it. I like
crowd.
it. I like it.
They want like the one. That's the tough question when there can only be one.
You can give us a couple.
One of the things, but I'm not going to use this one as my one, but is just how related the fiction and the nonfiction are. If you look at the drafts especially, you understand how his brain, how much they were connected, how much you have to read them together. But the second part, I would say, is his time in Istanbul. Now, Magdalena Zaborowska wrote a really great book about his decade in Istanbul, but there's nothing like going over there yourself. I went over there multiple times. My research assistant is Turkish, and I really took that decade seriously because it really helps us understand what was going on during the civil rights movement for him, and his need to get away and write from another place, but also his intense need to create these alternative kinship structures. Baldwin was incredibly close with his family, and one of his nephews, Hakeem Wilson, and his wife, Rochelle, are here tonight, so shout out.
Yes. Hello. Thank you for being here.
But he had to create, spent most of his life abroad, so he had to create these alternative kinship structures, and he did that in France. But what he created in Istanbul, he showed up in 1961 for the first time, frustrated with another country. There was a party going on at his friend Engin's house, a wedding party with his wife Gulriz. Baldwin shows up, exhausted, but they're all drunk on homemade vodka. They homemade their vodka in Turkey. And suddenly, he's singing Negro spirituals. They're singing Turkish work songs. He's hanging out with the most famous actors and actresses and activists. He's falling asleep on the lap of the most famous actress in Turkey. In the newspaper the next day, there's a story about how people would come up to Baldwin on the street and say, "I met you last night, but you were asleep on her lap." So, and that one thing I tried to convey in this book is that Baldwin lived a difficult life because those were difficult times, but he also had a lot of joy and love and community in his life. That's what he created around him. And in fact, that's what the blues are, right? The blues are creating beauty and joy out of pain. And he lived a blues life in that sense. So I want to really remember that. So it's not just Baldwin, sad story. Baldwin, orator. Baldwin, symbol. Baldwin, human being. Baldwin had the whole spectrum like we all do.
Yeah, no, you do a really beautiful job with that. Before I get to what I did want to ask you, can you speak a little bit about music and his relationship to it? I love that you help us, because you're painting a picture for us of these moments in his life when he's at with an artist residency, or he's in a small place in like Istanbul, or if he's somewhere in Europe. But there's always a record player, and he's always listening to songs, sometimes the same one again and again and again. Can you speak to how important it was for you to include that element in the book?
Yeah, he always said that, it was when he discovered that black music was his language, not necessarily the history of American literature, that he found his voice. He was talking about Bessie Smith. But, he also, when he was living in Istanbul, he lived in a house for a period down by the water, and his friend, a blues singer, Britis Redding, would come over, and they would sing the blues together late at night. And at first, the Turkish neighbors were like, who are these people? What are they doing? They were really upset, and they wanted him to leave. So they went silent, and then they ended up missing it. And slowly they started coming over, and they started asking them to sing again. They started hanging out together. And this is just a story of how Baldwin was able to create these communities across countries, across race, across gender, exactly the kinds of affiliations and communities that we have to be able to foster now to combat the kind of, the hatred that's happening in our country right now.
Yeah, it also makes me want to speak to his relationship to black women. Baldwin was very much I think there's an interesting thing in our society because we live in a patriarchal society. That's not an opinion, it's a fact. And we oftentimes ignore the feminine. And what I love about the images we see, whether it be or videos of him talking to Maya Angelou, or the image of him and Nina Simone dancing, the archival footage we have of him in conversation with Nikki Giovanni, obviously his relationship with Lorraine Hansberry, and the list goes on and on and on. But he was not afraid of the feminine. And he was willing to listen to black women. And I think it is one of the reasons why he lived such a joyful life, because he understood that the hierarchy we had was incorrect.
I think it was a journey for him. I mean, his journey to self-love was very complicated because he grew up being told he was ugly and all this stuff. But he used that journey to self-love to kind of talk about America's trouble with love, right? His relationship to gender is fascinating. I'm glad you brought it up. Now, he was very close to many women, many black women. Lorraine Hansberry, Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison. I mean, she went over to St. Paul de Vence, and he read all of If Beale Street Could Talk to her to see if he got the voice right. Lena Horne, Nina Simone. I mean, the list goes on and on.
So long, like
important
so many sisters. Yeah.
Black women writers, Gail Jones, he supported her career. But this was a journey for him. And one thing that I also really admire about Baldwin was that he was willing to change his mind.
Yes.
Which is also such an important lesson. So he was not always perfect when it came to feminism, for example. But he listened. He talked to Nikki Giovanni. He talked to Audre Lorde. They had some differences, but I think that was actually a turning point in his life where he realized, he started to think of himself as androgynous. He started to think that we're all androgynous. He wrote, each contains the other, male and female, black and white. He was starting to understand that. And his later work, he was exploring that in If Beale Street Could Talk and his final plays. So he was willing to change his mind about gender. He was willing to change his mind about Palestine. He was willing to change his mind about the civil rights movement. I mean, he got way more far to the left, as he got frustrated. He said, how much time do you want for your progress? So it's a lesson that I take that, sometimes we think we're so set in our beliefs, but Baldwin was willing to really think and, if necessary, change his mind.
Absolutely. And you also witness him do that in the conversation with Nikki Giovanni. It is one of my favorite elements of it.
Smoke a few cigarettes along the way.
Oh yeah, of course. Of course. I like when he lights a cigarette for her as well. But yes, you see him sort of saying, I see where you're coming from. I understand. What is your first memory of James Baldwin? No one wrote their name on this one. This is a really good question. Sorry.
That's a good one. Because Baldwin often wrote in his later essays. Another thing I admire about him, he'd say, "I don't trust my memory." He talks about a lot of it was blotted out, and he uses the untrustworthiness of memory as a kind of way into his essays. I do remember the first time I saw his face. It was a drawing. I went to the D.C. public schools. My 8th grade English teacher, Mrs. Miles, had drawings of famous black writers all over the cracked walls, and James Baldwin was one of them. And I remember his eyes. I thought that it ended there, but I recently spoke to her on the phone, and she said, "Oh no, Nick, you got dressed up in a suit and you came in and gave a presentation on Baldwin's entire life in the 8th grade." But I completely repressed it because I've also completely repressed the process of writing this book, so I repressed it. So that was, and then I stole my twin sister's copy of Giovanni's Room the next year, never gave it back, and read it. And then it was in college, that I really took a class where I read everything by him. But no, I'll never forget seeing that drawing, and the eyes in particular.
Beautiful. Last question. If you could want us to know one thing about James Baldwin, what would it be?
There's a jazz song called James Baldwin to the Rescue, and this is the moment where I want him to rescue me. I'm like, I could come down and tell me the one thing, I guess I would say that his art, his writing, his life, his art, it all came from love. It did. I think that's sort of obvious, but I think it's often forgotten, and that also there was this tenderness to him as a human being. People love to play those, it's amazing to watch, right? He's an incredible orator, and he's tough, but he was also, I think, at root, a very tender and loving person. And I think, sometimes people think his suffering was kind of the engine for his art, and I don't think so. I actually think his ability to connect and love people was.
That's a great answer. Thank you, everyone. Please get the book if you haven't already. It's worth your time. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Nicholas, for writing this. Thank you for all the hours. I said this to you already, but thank you for all the hours, the sacrifice, the time, the passion, the commitment. This is now our new inheritance, and we are forever grateful.
It's an honor. It's an honor.
Thank you both very much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Nicholas will be signing the book in the lobby, so please buy this beautiful biography. Thank you very much. Thank you.